Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and today, as part of my B-Tier guides for Dragon Age Origins, I'm going to take you through a build idea for a fear-inducing, damaging tank warrior. I find it a little disappointing that weapon and shield characters mostly get relegated to a tank build that isn't fun, doesn't do much damage, and frankly also isn't as cool looking as other builds in the game. So the fearsome warrior build is meant to remedy that by taking advantage of the defensive capabilities of weapon and shield, while also going more aggressive with the specializations. This build could be used on your warrior warden or any of the usual warrior companions. If you want to make this on your companions, I highly recommend getting a specialization mod, since this will be a weapon and shield build in Sten and Ogren's case, and Alistair should be respecialized because of his Templar specialization. If you plan on making your warden a fearsome warrior, the origin I recommend is the Dwarven Noble for 4 reasons. Good starting abilities, improved combat training, and the shield bash talent. Dwarves have an innate 10% spell resistance, you can obtain 25 gold during the origin, and you also get access to the Idukan family shield and to selling items for more money at Gorem in Denrim. Of course, a human noble works just as well in terms of starting abilities, since they're the same, but you don't really get any other positives. But do keep in mind that you can also make a dwarf commoner, Dalish, or city elf warrior without issues. You'll just have worse starting abilities. I personally like to use the no starting abilities mod so that I can choose all the skills and abilities during character creation without the game auto-assigning some of them. There is one other mod that I highly recommend, which I mention in pretty much all of my DAO guides, which is Dane's Fixes. It resolves many combat and item related bugs, it implements item properties and other missing features, and for this build in particular, I think the tweak for shield offensive talents is welcome, as it fixes some bugs and improves their damage and effectiveness in a way that feels balanced. During character creation for your warden, here's what I recommend. For starting attributes, put most of your points in strength, though I do also recommend getting your cunning up by 1 or 2 points if you eventually want to max out your coercion skill. If you don't care about coercion all that much, you can put those 1-2 points into dexterity instead. For skills, I recommend either getting an extra point in combat training or a point in coercion. And for abilities, you should already have Shield Bash unlocked if you're a human or dwarf noble, so I recommend unlocking Shield Pummel and the warrior's powerful passive. If you're starting with a different talent, then pick up Shield Bash and Shield Pummel. In terms of starting gear, during the Dwarf Noble origin, you're mainly focused on money, since you lose all your items when you're exiled. The Note of Credit from Lord Dace can be sold to a merchant for 25 gold. And I also recommend selling whatever else you can, such as the Noble's Dagger, the Proving Helm, and whatever other junk you find in containers, before going on the expedition, since you'll lose all non-DLC items at the end of it. During the Exile portion, you can get a Fine Dwarven Blade from Harrowmont, which just has a +2 attack bonus, but it's better than a basic sword. In a dead-end tunnel in the Deep Road's outskirts, you can also find the Superior Dwarven Guard Armor, a heavy chest piece that grants +1 armor and +10 physical resistance. It's a great early game armor due to the large bonus to physical resistance, which paired with other early items can make you nearly impervious to abilities like Shield Bash, which rely on breaching physical resistance. Do keep in mind that it requires 20 strength to equip, so be sure to put enough points in strength at character creation and then when you level up during the origin so that you can equip this ASAP. Moving on to the recommended attributes. As a weapon and shield damaging tank, you'll be mainly focusing on strength, so put most of your points into it. You will also need a total of 26 dexterity to be able to unlock the Shield Mastery passive, but that one is available starting at level 12, so it's not a rush. In general, put 2 points in strength and 1 in dexterity whenever you level up, until you reach 26 dexterity. Other than these main attributes, I recommend putting a few points up to a score of 13 to 15 in magic so that you can increase the effectiveness of health poultices. You can just put 1 point into magic instead of dexterity once every 2 to 3 levels until you reach 13 to 15 magic. If you want to max out coercion and possibly survival, you will need a total of 16 cunning. You can get bonuses to cunning during the Fade portion of the Broken Circle quest, but if you don't want to bother hunting special attribute fonts, you can just put a few points into cunning yourself. In my opinion, the best time to increase your cunning is exactly when you get a skill point that you want to invest into coercion, and you need those 2 points in cunning to unlock the new coercion tier. Finally, put some points up to a total score of around 20 or so into willpower in order to increase your max stamina. You'll mainly increase your stamina through bonuses from gear, but I do find it useful to invest a few points into willpower during the early mid-game, around levels 7 to 12, when those stamina gear bonuses aren't yet readily available. For skills, I recommend maxing out combat training so you have access to the highest tier of combat talents. If you want to use Persuasion and Intimidation during your playthrough, I also highly recommend maxing out Coercion, but in the early game it's enough to just have the first 2 ranks. In the mid game, after you've maxed out combat training, you can return to Coercion and max it out if you desire. Other than these two skills, if you've watched my other builds, you know that I'm not a huge fan of crafting skills, although in this case I do recommend putting 1 point into poison making so that you can use poisons on your weapons. You can have one of the rogue companions max it out so that they can craft higher tier poisons, you just need to have 1 point so you can use them. Finally, survival is the last skill I recommend because it offers a decent bonus to nature resistance. You get a total of plus 25% if you max out the skill, and the final rank also gives you plus 2 physical resistance. Survival also allows you to see enemies on the map, which can help you plan out more difficult fights, especially when dealing with multiple spellcasters. If you're making this build on a companion, you may want to set up their tactics so that they can execute it on their own without you micromanaging them, so only for your companions, I recommend putting points into the tactics skill so that they get some extra tactics slots. This fearsome warrior build is for an offensive weapon and shield tank. This build really comes alive when you can unlock and use various abilities from your specializations. Until then, you'll need to unlock tank talents like Taunt and Threaten, all the offensive weapon and shield talents from the first row, as well as the entire third row of weapon and shield for defenses and improving your other talents. I'm going to take you through all the useful abilities. From the warrior tree, Powerful is a passive that grants plus 25 health and a 10% reduction to fatigue, which comes from wearing armor. This fatigue reduction is impartial to armor type, so it's particularly useful for a warrior who wants to wear heavy or massive sets, which naturally have higher fatigue associated with them. Threaten is an essential tank talent, a sustained mode that increases enemy hostility with each of the warrior's melee attacks, drawing enemies away from allies. This sustained works even better for this aggressive tank build since you'll actually be dealing quite a bit of damage to enemies, and the hostility generated is based on the damage you do. Unlock this as soon as it becomes available. Bravery is a passive that grants bonuses of plus 1 damage and plus 3 physical and mental resistance. It also increases the warrior's critical hit chance by plus 3.5%, proportionally to the number of enemies above 2 engaged in melee with the warrior. A great talent for this build in particular since you do actually care about the increased crit chance since your warrior actually does a good amount of damage. Death Blow is a passive that restores stamina to the warrior whenever they land a killing blow on an enemy. The amount of stamina restored is equal to 20% of the victim's total base health. Precise Striking is a sustained talent that grants a bonus of plus 10 attack and a small bonus to melee crit chance while imposing a minus 10% attack speed debuff. The melee crit chance bonus is between 3% and 15% based on the character's level. Due to the fact that this slows down your attack speed, don't use it unless you have a mage in your party keeping the haste spell active. However, this talent can be quite useful if you do use haste due to the bonuses to attack and crit chance, so that's why I mention it as a recommended talent. Taunt is the other essential tank talent, immediately generating 300 threat on all enemies within 10 meters of the warrior. We'll also be increasing the threat by another 100 points with one of the passive bonuses from the Reaver specialization. I recommend picking this up fairly quickly so that your warrior can tank effectively, since even with Threaten active, there will be times when enemies will suddenly target one of your other allies and you need to immediately redirect them towards your tank. From the weapon and shield tree, you're interested in the first and third rows, so you'll want Shield Bash, Shield Pummel, Overpower, Assault, Shield Block, Shield Cover, Shield Tactics, and Shield Mastery. Shield Bash is a very useful cheap talent to use when you want to quickly disable or interrupt an enemy, especially when they're in the process of casting or using a dangerous ability. This is because Shield Bash can knock down its target unless it passes a physical resistance check versus the warrior's strength. I particularly like using this to knock down spellcasters, though I also use it to interrupt enemy warriors from using the Shield Pummel ability so that they don't stun my warrior. Shield Pummel is another great cheap talent to use when you want to disable an enemy because it can stun the enemy unless it passes a physical resistance check versus the warrior's strength. This talent can also do a decent amount of damage, especially if you have the Dane's Fixes tweak, since it includes a strike with a weapon and 2 strikes with a shield, and they are all executed with a plus 10 bonus to attack and plus 2 armor penetration, and they can be crits. Overpower makes your warrior strike with a shield 3 times, with all hits being critical. If the last strike connects, the target is knocked down unless it passes a physical resistance check versus the warrior's strength. I like to use this talent to guarantee crits on a frozen or petrified target, which means it can shatter the target. And it is possible to also shatter elite enemies, though the chance is quite low. But since you have 3 quick crits in a row with Overpower, that chance increases significantly. Assault is the final offensive weapon and shield talent, which involves 4 strikes on a target, each strike having a bonus of plus 8 attack and plus 3 armor penetration. However, the damage done is reduced by 40% for each strike that connects. The strikes can crit. I think that despite the reduction in damage for the strikes after the first one, this can still do a decent amount of damage. Shield Block is a passive that causes enemies to no longer receive flanking bonus when attacking the warrior on the shield carrying side. There is a slight issue with this bonus because it ends up removing the bonus from enemies when they're on the warrior's weapon side, but it's fine either way, just a small defensive bonus on the way to better talents. Shield Cover is a sustained talent that increases the warrior's missile deflection by +10. It can be upgraded with an additional +10 by unlocking Shield Mastery. I think this is the best defensive sustain that this fearsome warrior build should activate because it only needs to be activated when you're fighting archers. Otherwise, the warrior will be fine tanking melee hits from melee enemies due to having a high armor score. But arrows can really hurt, especially when multiple archers are attacking your warrior as you're running towards them, so have this ready to activate to protect yourself from arrows and bolts. Shield Tactics is a passive that provides immunity to backstabs. However, this won't protect your warrior against enemies with coup de grace in the situation that your warrior is stunned or paralyzed, so do keep that in mind. But other than these two status effects, you don't have to worry much about rogue enemies, which is nice because their backstabs can do a significant amount of damage due to high armor penetration. Finally, Shield Mastery improves all of your active and sustained weapon and shield talents. It increases the damage of the offensive talents, adds further defense bonuses to shield defense and shield wall, which we don't use for this build, and increases shield cover's missile deflection by another +10. In the base game, there is some weird bug with the damage calculations when it comes to shields, so again, I highly recommend getting the tweak for offensive shield talents from Dane's Fixes to actually make these talents work the way they were supposed to. There are also two special abilities I want to mention that are outside of the warrior and weapon and shield trees. They are from the Power of Blood tree that you can unlock as part of the Warden's Keep DLC. These will only be available for your Warden, so you can't get them on the companion warriors. They're not essential to the build, but they are useful. Bloodthirst is a sustained talent that grants a +25% boost to melee attack speed, +10% melee and ranged crit chance, and +20% movement speed. However, while activated, it drains -10 health every 2 seconds, and damage taken by your Warden is increased by 20%, which means you actually get -12 health drained every 2 seconds. The melee attack speed and crit chance increases are awesome, as long as you are okay with the health drain. You can also use this very nicely in Exploration for the increase in movement speed, especially in large areas that require some backtracking, such as in the deep roads. It also works well together with haste. The health drain is kind of annoying, but you could offset this by having some large bonuses to health regen from the Life Giver ring or from Kaelin's armor set, as well as simply making sure that your mages heal you when your health gets low, or else use poultices to keep yourself topped up. Blood Fury is an activated talent that drains 40 health from the warrior immediately and knocks back targets in a 5-meter radius around the warrior if they fail a physical resistance check versus the warrior's strength. It's great to have a knockback effect that checks against your strength since the warrior generally doesn't have many crowd control options. It's not super amazing since it's just knockback and not knockdown, but it's still useful to push enemies away from you for a bit. While you have the essential tank abilities as well as your bread and butter offensive talents from weapon and shield, the fearsome aspect of this build comes alive through the use of two specializations, Berserker and Reaver. You'll want to unlock Berserker at level 7 because its talents are available at lower levels, and Reaver will be unlocked at level 14. The Berserker specialization focuses on damaging enemies. This will of course help you out offensively since more damage means killing enemies faster, but it also helps your tanking abilities because, as I mentioned earlier, the Threaten Sustained makes your warrior generate threat based on the amount of damage they deal. Unlocking Berserker also grants your warrior +2 strength and +10 health, which are great bonuses to get. I generally recommend unlocking the first 3 abilities from the tree, though you may also want to unlock the final one for a few situations when it may be worth using. I'll explain when we get to it. Berserk is the main ability of this specialization, a sustained which grants +8 damage and +10 mental resistance, while also incurring a penalty of -2 stamina regeneration. This penalty can easily be offset with various pieces of gear, which I'll talk about in the gear section. And anyway, once you're level 10, you can get rid of the stamina regen penalty entirely with the Constraint passive. Once you have enough stamina regen bonuses to be able to keep this up without draining your stamina, use it at all times. I highly recommend looking for stamina regen bonuses in the early game so that you can use this as soon as you unlock it or very soon afterwards. Resilience is a passive that upgrades the Berserk sustained by adding a bonus of 1.5 health regen while Berserk is active. Your warrior also gets a permanent +5% nature resistance bonus. Constraint is a passive that adds a +2 bonus to stamina regen while Berserk is active, effectively removing the initial penalty the ability had. This is available starting with level 10, and while you may be excited to unlock it since it upgrades Berserk, you don't actually need to. If you have gear bonuses to stamina regen that offset Berserk, you're all set. So this is more of an optional unlock for later on in the game, only if you want to unlock the final ability in the tree. Speaking of, Final Blow is an activated talent that makes the warrior take a huge swing at an enemy. If the strike connects, the attack drains all of the warrior's remaining stamina and deals damage equal to half of the stamina consumed. The reason why I put this as an optional unlock is because the moment your Final Blow connects, all of your sustained talents such as Berserk, Shield Cover, Precise Striking, and so on will be deactivated immediately and put on cooldown. So I only recommend using Final Blow in a very specific situation. When you're fighting a powerful enemy, they are the only enemy left in the fight, and you're fairly certain your Final Blow will kill them or get them to extremely low HP so that one of your other characters can kill them. If you do want to use Final Blow in this way when fighting various bosses, I highly recommend getting as many bonuses to stamina and willpower as you can, and perhaps even putting some extra points into willpower during level ups, maybe up to a score of 25 to 30. This is so that you can really take advantage of the huge damage you could deal to an enemy if your warrior has a ton of stamina. I would also make sure your warrior has close to full stamina when using this, so it's good to have good stamina regen bonuses so that your stamina regenerates fairly quickly. The Rejuvenate spell could also be used to further boost your stamina regen for 10 seconds before using Final Blow. The second specialization I recommend is Reaver, which is similar to Blood Magic in some ways, though it's based on abilities gained by drinking dragon blood. A very interesting lore tidbit is that some of the people in the Theron bloodline, such as King Calanhad and even King Merrick, had such abilities. So it may be more lore appropriate than you think for a certain royal bastard, even though on the surface it may seem antithetical to his character. Unlocking the Reaver specialization grants +1 constitution and +5 physical resistance. The unlock bonuses aren't nearly as good as the ones for Berserker, and I frankly don't understand why. The Berserker gets +10 health, but you only get +1 constitution as a Reaver, which equals +5 health, and a +5 phys res isn't nearly as impressive as +2 strength. Regardless, the Reaver's abilities do make up for it, although I only recommend the first two with the third as an optional unlock. Devour is an activated talent that absorbs the energy of enemy corpses within 5 meters of the warrior, restoring a decent amount of health to the warrior. Interestingly, this talent's healing scales with spell power, so those few points put into magic that I recommended will improve the healing you get from Devour. Do note that if you use this talent immediately after killing an enemy, it won't heal because the enemy isn't yet fully registered as dead. The moment a corpse becomes lootable, however, Devour can be used to its full effect. I think this is a great talent to have as a decent heal for when you don't necessarily want to use a poultice or your mage's healing spells are on cooldown. Your warrior will be in the thick of battle, likely with dead enemies surrounding them quite soon after the fight begins, so you might as well use those corpses for something. Frightening Appearance is a single target disabling talent that causes the target to cower in fear unless it passes a mental resistance check versus the warrior's strength. It also provides the warrior with a passive +100 increase to the threat generated by taunt, which is great for a tank. In the base game, this is also supposed to buff the threat you generate with your warrior's attacks while Threaten is active, but it isn't properly implemented. However, if you have Dane's fixes, then this bonus will work properly and you will be drawing triple threat instead of double while having Threaten up. Frightening Appearance is much more useful than it may initially appear. It's basically a strength-based horror that can't be resisted through spell resistance since it's just a regular talent. And due to requiring mental resistance, it can completely disable powerful physical enemies such as ogres or various alpha darkspawn reliably for a long duration. And of course, the bonuses to threat generation are simply amazing for tanks. Aura of Pain is the final ability I recommend from the Reaver tree, and only as an optional unlock. It's a sustained talent that deals continuous spirit damage, 20 damage per 4 seconds, to the warrior as well as to all enemies within 4 meters of the warrior. Having spirit resistance won't reduce the amount of spirit damage your warrior takes, however, so really the only way to deal with it is through health regeneration and healing. This sustained also grants a penalty of -5 health regeneration, but keep in mind that health regen is capped below at 0, unlike mana or stamina regen, so characters don't lose health over time if they have negative health regen. And of course, you can get various health regen bonuses that can completely offset this penalty, meaning you can still passively regenerate health while this is active. Personally, I would only use this for small amounts of time when the warrior is engaged with a bunch of weaker enemies, perhaps in combination with some other AoE damaging ability done by an ally. An interesting thing to do would be to have a mage cast Affliction Hex on the beefiest enemy in the group, which will reduce the elemental resistances of all nearby enemies, including spirit resistance, and thus make the spirit damage of Aura of Pain far more potent against those enemies. Moving on to recommended gear. As a more damage-focused weapon and shield warrior, you won't have a high defense since you aren't increasing your dexterity past the 26 requirement for shield mastery. Due to this, you'll have to use heavy or massive armor so that you defend yourself properly against physical attacks. And you'll want some good bonuses to your max health so that you can tank enemy hits for longer before needing to heal. Health regen is also good, but there really are only a few items that have it as a bonus. Even though your defense is low, you can still improve your chance to avoid a physical enemy attack entirely by getting gear with bonuses to dodge chance. Not a lot of these in the game, but enough for a decent chance. Against certain types of enemies, you may also want to have some gear or consumables with you that increase your resistance to a particular element, such as fire resistance versus rage demons, abominations, many spellcasters who use fire spells, and dragons or high dragons, nature resistance against spiders, or spirit resistance against the archdemon or arcane horrors. Specifically against spellcasters, you will want to have some bonuses to spell resistance, which will make it more likely for your warrior to resist enemy spells. This is particularly good on a dwarf who already has that innate 10% spell resistance. From a damaging perspective, you'll also want some good bonuses to stamina, either directly or by getting bonuses to willpower, as well as stamina regen, especially if you want to use the Berserker's final blow to great effect against bosses. Bonuses to damage, armor penetration, attack, and possibly critical chance or critical damage are also good, but they have to fit well with your other requirements for defensive stats as a tank. Let's discuss your weapon and shield. The best option, in my opinion, is the Kaelin's arm set, comprised of Merrick's blade and Kaelin's shield. They have a set bonus of plus 5 damage and plus 5 stamina regen in combat. They can be looted as part of the Return to Ostagar DLC. Merrick's blade grants plus 0.75 health combat regen and stamina regen, plus 6 damage versus Darkspawn, and weakens nearby Darkspawn. The Darkspawn weakening effect isn't implemented in the base game, but if you have Dane's fixes, then it applies the effects of Aura of Weakness, minus 10 attack and defense, and a physical resistance check for a 30% movement speed slow to any Darkspawn in the area. Kaelin's shield grants plus 1 armor and plus 20 missile deflection. Not the most amazing shield on its own, but due to the set bonus, I think it's absolutely worth it. However, you may want to use this set on an arcane warrior instead of your fearsome warrior, so I'll also give you a few other options for one-handed weapons and shields you can use. In the very early game, you may want to use Sir Garland's sword due to its plus 2 attack and plus 10 physical resistance bonuses. Paired with the superior dwarven guard armor your dwarf noble warden has from their origin, it can make your warden pretty much immune to effects that check their physical resistance at least early on. You can obtain this by lying to the elven messenger at Ostagar. Asturian's Might is a pretty good longsword for the early and mid-game, granting plus 2 damage and plus 1 armor penetration, plus the weakens nearby Darkspawn effect. It can be obtained during Warden's Keep DLC by completing the Ancient History side quest. A more niche weapon pick is the Keening Blade, which has plus 3 cold damage, plus 6 attack, and plus 2 armor penetration, as well as 3 rune slots. I usually don't recommend this because it requires you to complete the Unbound side quest and kill Gaxgang, but I think this weapon kind of fits the scary vibe of the build based on its description. This blade makes an eerie wail just on the edge of hearing whenever it cuts the air. It's also a very solid weapon, though the cold damage isn't amazing if you're fighting undead because they're resistant to cold. It's just a bit of extra damage though, so it's not a big deal. A non-sword weapon I can recommend is the Veshial, an expensive war axe that grants plus 2 strength, plus 5% melee crit chance, plus 1 combat stamina regen, plus 10% critical damage, plus 2 nature damage, and it also has 3 rune slots. The nature damage is kind of useless since many enemies are resistant and immune to it, but the rest of the stats are great. If you want to increase your crit chance and crit damage, this is the best one-handed strength-based weapon for that. You can purchase this from Bodan in the party camp for 131 gold and 55 silver. Super expensive, but in my opinion, worth it for this build. In terms of shields, here are the options if you don't plan on using the Kaelin's arm set. An amazing early shield you can get is Eamon's shield. It requires 22 strength to equip and grants plus 6 defense and plus 25 stamina. You can loot it from the locked vault on the upper floor of Redcliffe Castle. Frankly, I've kept this shield on my warrior for the whole game sometimes. It's just really good. The Idukan family shield is a good shield you can get for free if you're a dwarf noble when you first speak to Gorham in the Denerim Market District. It requires 30 strength to equip and grants plus 1 cunning, plus 1 constitution, plus 9 defense, and plus 4 damage versus Darkspawn. If you're not planning on using Final Blow, so literally in any non-boss combat situation, I think this shield is far better than Eamon's shield since it has more defensive stats as well as some extra damage versus Darkspawn. If you're going to kill Gaxgang for the Keening Blade, you might also want to use the shield Fade Wall, which also drops from killing this boss. It grants plus 3 defense, plus 20% healing effects received, plus 1 combat stamina regen, and plus 25 stamina. I I highly recommend having Dane's Fixes because the healing effects bonus doesn't work in the base game, but also because in the base game this is a rare drop for some reason. It sucks that you potentially have to reload and kill Gaxgang multiple times until you get this to drop. So do yourself a favor and only go after Fade Wall if you have Dane's Fixes. Otherwise, this is a great shield because it's a heavy shield, so it automatically has the highest base defense and missile deflection due to its type, and its bonuses are great for the build, especially the extra stamina for Final Blow. But even without Final Blow, the base stats of the shield are better than any of the other shields on this list. Moving on to armor. Rather than going one by one to discuss single armor pieces for each slot, I'll talk about the most useful armor sets for this build and where you can obtain the set pieces. I will discuss helmets separately, however, because some armor sets don't include helmets. My top choice of armor set is Kaelin's armor set, a massive set that has the following stats: plus 4 armor, plus 10 mental resistance, plus 15% critical damage, plus 15 physical resistance, plus 20% dodge chance. The set bonuses are minus 25% fatigue and plus 5 combat health regen. It can be obtained as part of the Return to Ostagar DLC, when you can also obtain Kaelin's arms. This is an armor set that does have a helmet. If you're interested in Frankensteining your armor instead of wearing sets, then Kaelin's greaves, aka the boots, are the best element since they grant a huge plus 20% dodge chance. The only potential downside to Kaelin's armor set is that if you obtain it early, it's not going to have base stats as good as other massive armor pieces you can find later in the game, because the tier it drops at will depend on your Warden's level when you return to Ostagar. The massive Warden Commander set is in a similar boat because it can be obtained by killing the possessed corpse of Sophia Dryden as part of the Warden's Keep DLC. The set grants plus 1 armor, plus 0.5 combat stamina regen, plus 15% critical damage, plus 10 physical resistance, plus 50 stamina, and plus 10% fire resistance. The set bonus is minus 12% fatigue and plus 2 constitution. This set does not have a helmet. As you can see, the bonuses aren't nearly as good as Kaelin's, so my recommendation is to get the Warden Commander set earlier on and use it until you get to at least level 14, 15 or so, and then do the Return to Ostagar DLC to get Kaelin's set if you want to have that one at a higher tier. If you want to Frankenstein your armor, the chest piece from this set is quite good, though there are better options. However, just because these sets will be a lower base tier if you loot them at a lower level, that doesn't mean their bonuses aren't still amazing. I would absolutely wear Kaelin's armor set over any other set simply for its bonuses, or at least wear the greaves even if other boots may have a higher base armor score. If you want to Frankenstein your armor together, there are a few other pieces I recommend. The heavy chest piece Yvonne the Great's Mail, purchasable from Heren in Wade's Smithy in Denerim after you have completed 3 main quests. It grants plus 1 combat health and stamina regen, plus 6 armor, plus 10% dodge chance, and plus 10 missile deflection. Due to being the highest tier, tier 7, as well as having a large bonus to armor, I think this chest piece stacks very well against massive chest pieces in terms of armor score. So if for example you've been using the Warden Commander chest piece while doing the first 3 main quests and want to upgrade your chest piece, Yvonne's is a great pickup. In terms of gloves, there aren't many amazing pieces out there, so I recommend the Heavy Gloves of Diligence, which are tier 6 and have a plus 4 armor bonus. They can be looted from a locked chest in the Orzammar Shaperate, so you can get them fairly easily as long as you can get past the mercenaries in the Frostback Mountain Pass to gain access to Orzammar. Kaelin's gauntlets are the second option for the fact that they're massive and have plus 1 armor and plus 15% critical damage, but in that case I just recommend you use Kaelin's armor set completely. In terms of helmets, if you aren't using Kaelin's armor set, you'll be able to choose a standalone helm, and there are 2 really good options. A great helmet you'll have from the beginning of the game is Helm of the Deep, a DLC item which grants plus 2 constitution and plus 10 mental and physical resistance. If you want, you could keep this for the entire game without issue, though there is one helmet that reigns supreme. Helm of Honleith is a tier 2 heavy helmet that grants plus 3 armor and plus 2 to all attributes. Even though it's a tier 2 helm, the plus 3 armor bonus still puts its total armor rating well above any tier 7 heavy helmet, and a plus 2 to all attributes is also great, making it a perfect complement to armor sets that lack a helmet, or in the case of wearing mismatched armor pieces. It can be looted as part of the Stone Prisoner DLC in Honleith Village. Do note that pretty much every warrior and rogue loves this helmet due to being very easy to equip and having amazing stats, so you'll have to choose who to give it to. Don't feel obligated to use it on your fearsome warrior. Helm of the Deep is just fine. There is one other helmet I want to mention briefly, which is the Executioner's Helm. It's a heavy helmet of variable tier which grants plus 25 stamina. It can be purchased from Caesar's special stock in Denerim, as well as possible to drop as random loot from a bunch of enemies in containers. I wouldn't use this as the main helmet, but you could keep it in your inventory and equip your warrior with it when you're about to fight a big boss enemy that you want to use Final Blow on, so that you increase your stamina and thus the damage of Final Blow. Finally, let's talk about accessories. In terms of belts, there's unfortunately not many good choices. so it's very likely that other characters may also want these belts, especially the first two. Cinch of Skillful Maneuvering is the best in slot, granting +1 to all attributes, plus 10% spell resistance, and plus 10% dodge chance. It's a DLC-related item that can be unlocked by gathering the lore of Kadash Taig during the Witch Hunt DLC, and afterwards it will be always available in your inventory from the beginning of the game. A very powerful item that pretty much everyone is happy to wear. Anduril's Blessing is the second best belt because it's less useful as it doesn't have spell resistance or dodge chance, and it's expensive. It grants +2 to all attributes, plus 20% nature resistance, plus 2 combat mana and stamina regen, and plus 10 physical resistance. It's purchasable from the Quartermaster in the Circle Tower for 106 gold and 2 silver. I very much prefer the Cinch over this for a tank due to the better defensive items on the Cinch, but I wanted to mention this as an option. Honestly, other than these two, you could use a bunch of other belts for small bonuses like +1 to armor, armor penetration, or strength, all of which are fine but nothing special. The only other belt I can shout out for doing something slightly better is Embree's Mini Pockets, a DLC item which grants +5% to all elemental resistances. It's not amazing, but paired with other resistance bonuses from gear, consumables, passives, or spells, it's a decent bonus. If you don't have access to the Cinch and can't afford Anduril's Blessing, Embree's Mini Pockets is the one belt I recommend for the defensive buffs. In terms of amulets, the options are a bit more plentiful, though there is one best option, the Spell Ward, which grants +5 willpower, plus 8 exploration health regen, plus 30% spell resistance, plus 10% dodge chance, and plus 6 missile deflection. The spell resistance and dodge chance are the main draw of this amulet, though of course the missile deflection is nice, and more willpower means more stamina. You can purchase this from Bodan for 87 gold, 67 silver, and 50 copper. I highly recommend making this a high priority to purchase quite early because it genuinely grants a lot of bonuses useful for your tank. Very good to have this when going into the Circle Tower, for example, due to the spell resistance helping you fight various spellcaster enemies. Until you can use the Spell Ward, or if for some reason you really want to use it on someone else, I recommend using one of two defensive amulets. Mark of Vigilance is a DLC amulet that grants +6 defense, plus 2% spell resistance, and plus 5 mental resistance. And Magister's Shield is an amulet you can obtain from the deserted building in Denrim while doing the side quest The Last Request, and grants +6 defense, plus 12 missile deflection, plus 4% spell resistance, and minus 10% nature resistance. It's always good for a tank to have more defensive bonuses, and these two amulets also have a small bonus to spell resistance, which is nice. Not nearly as good as the Spell Ward, but decent options you get without having to spend your gold. If you would like to increase your health by a large amount in order to more reliably use the Reaver's Aura of Pain and tank more damage, then I recommend the Blood Gorged Amulet, which grants +12 Constitution, meaning +60 health, but which also has penalties of -3 strength and willpower. I usually recommend this one for blood mages, but you may feel like the +60 health is worth the penalties. You can obtain the Blood Gorged Amulet from Kadash Taig when doing Shale's personal quest. Finally, in terms of rings, there are a few standout options to increase the survivability of your fearsome tank. Lifegiver grants +10 Constitution, aka +50 health, +3 combat health regen, +10 exploration health regen, +3 armor, plus 20% to healing effects received. It's purchasable from Garen in the Orzammar Commons for 87 gold and 88 silver. The healing effects received bonus is bugged in the base game, but it's properly implemented by Dane's fixes. This is another one of those items that is ideal for a blood mage, but if you aren't using a blood mage, then it fits perfectly with this build. Extra health, health regen, armor, and better healing. Extremely good for a tank who is more focused on damaging enemies and thus doesn't have the high defense scores of other weapon and shield tanks. Key to the City is a generally beloved ring by a character of any class. It grants +2 to all attributes, plus 4% spell resistance, and plus 10% to healing effects received. It can be obtained by doing a secret quest, The Key to the City, by finding codex entries strewn around the various areas of Orzammar. You'll likely want to use this on all of your characters, but there's only one item, so it's fine if you decide against using it on this warrior. You can simply choose something else, such as Band of Fire, which is a DLC item that grants +3 Constitution, aka +15 health, plus 25% fire resistance, and plus 10% spirit resistance. It's a nice free defensive ring, and so even if it doesn't pack as much of a punch as Lifegiver, it's still worth using as a secondary ring. Or another great option for a secondary ring is the Ring of Ages, which grants plus 20% to all elemental resistances. It's fairly expensive, being purchasable from the Wonders of Theta shop in Denrim for 78 gold and 30 silver. But since you have high armor, health, and potentially quite high spell resistance, increasing your elemental resistances by a significant amount rounds out your defensive capabilities nicely. Before we move on to tactics, let's discuss runes and consumables. The runes I recommend the most are Fire and Lightning runes, which add elemental damage to your weapon's attacks. Fire is great against Darkspawn and Undead as they are weak to it, and Lightning is more generally useful against enemies since it's a very rarely resisted element. I would put 2 such powerful elemental runes in your warrior's weapon, and if your weapon has 3 rune slots, then as a 3rd rune I would either put a 3rd elemental rune, or if you feel like you need it, you can put either a Hail rune for the extra physical resistance, or a Dwemer rune for spell resistance. I wouldn't bother with anything below Master tier for these defensive runes. For the elemental runes, any extra damage is worth it, though of course the Master and Grandmaster runes are the best ones, adding +4 and +5 damage of their element respectively. In terms of consumables, I've already mentioned you may want to have some defensive ones that grant you various elemental resistances when you know you'll be up against an enemy that has particularly strong elemental abilities. You'll need Warmth Bombs against High Dragons, and Spirit Bombs against the Archdemon's spirit damage abilities. Outside of these particular encounters, I wouldn't personally bother with elemental resistance consumables, but it's up to you if you feel there's other difficult encounters where you could use some of these for defensive buffs. Poisons are also consumables which you have to apply to your melee weapon for your attacks to have additional effects. The main type of poisons I like to use are the ones that have a chance to stun the target on hit. These are Deathroot Extract and Concentrated Deathroot Extract, Crow Poison and Concentrated Crow Poison, and Flesh Rot. Flesh Rot is a tier 3 poison that has the highest chance to stun, 20%, but only stuns the target for 5 seconds, whereas the Concentrated Crow Poison is also tier 3 and has a 15% chance to stun, but the stun is longer, 7 seconds. Of course, higher tier poisons are more expensive to make, and I certainly don't recommend buying them, so you could simply use the basic Deathroot Extract that has a 10% chance to stun the target for 3 seconds. However, I only recommend these stunning poisons if you have a mage in your party with haste active, or you're using the Bloodthirst sustained, because otherwise I feel that your warrior's attacks will be too slow to take advantage of the chance to stun per hit. In case you don't have high attack speed, or perhaps you don't care as much about stunning enemies and simply want to deal more damage to them, I recommend 2 poisons that deal spirit damage, and the weapon coating that deals electricity damage. The tier 3 demonic poison deals 5 spirit damage per hit, and the tier 4 concentrated demonic poison deals 10 spirit damage per hit. The tier 3 shock coating deals 3 electricity damage per hit. Spirit and electricity damage are quite rarely resisted damage types, and no enemy types are completely immune to them. Abominations and steel golems are resistant to electricity, demons have a tiny amount of spirit resistance, and ogres also have a bit of spirit resistance. The archdemon is quite resistant to all elemental damage, so in the archdemon's case, I mostly recommend focusing on big physical damage numbers, as well as things that can reduce its resistances, such as the mage spells Vulnerability Hex and Affliction Hex. In any case, I always consider poisons to be optional, because it can be annoying to have to apply them to your weapons at the start of every fight, as well as sometimes need to reapply them in the middle of a longer fight because they only last for 60 seconds. The higher tier poisons are also quite expensive to craft, and I much rather prefer buying good gear that has a permanent effect rather than ingredients for consumables that last for 1 minute. Finally, let's discuss tactics, how to execute the build, what party compositions I recommend, and what abilities from other characters combine well with the fearsome warrior. The main sustained talents you have to keep up at all times are Threaten and Berserk. For Berserk, you have to have +2 combat stamina regeneration, or have the constraint passive which removes its penalty to stamina regen. If you can handle the life drain, Bloodthirst will increase your attack speed and critical chance, much better than the small bonus to critical chance you can get with Precise Striking, which reduces your attack speed. So if you have health regen bonuses and good sources of healing, then I highly recommend having Bloodthirst active as your 3rd sustained. If you're okay with the life drain, it will also help you move faster in exploration, so you could keep it on at all times if you aren't accidentally going to get your warrior killed. One optional mode to turn on only in some situations is Shield Cover, which grants you a bonus to missile deflection. You can set this up automatically in Tactics to be activated when your character is attacked by a ranged type of attack. However, it won't automatically turn off later, so you will have to keep an eye and turn it off when you aren't fighting archers so that it doesn't keep some of your stamina hostage. You should use Taunt fairly often to keep enemies away from your allies, either whenever you see an ally getting attacked by an enemy in melee, or just whenever Taunt comes off cooldown. If you want to use it off cooldown, then just put it in your warrior's tactics as Self, Any, Use Taunt. Your main damage will come from your auto attacks, as well as the offensive shield talents like Shield Pummel, Overpower, and Assault. Of course, Final Blow is a huge damaging ability, but I only recommend using it to kill a big boss, and using it manually. For Overpower, be sure to set up a tactic or remember to use it when an enemy is either frozen or petrified to have a bigger chance to shatter them with Overpower's crits. I would recommend keeping Shield Bash as something to use manually to quickly interrupt an enemy ability like a mage casting a spell, a warrior starting to use shield pummel, etc. If you want to make sure your warrior is top on health, I do recommend adding a tactic where they use the lowest available type of health poultice when they're under 30% HP. However, most of the time I have a mage in my party who can cast heal and group heal, and so I prefer to let my mages do most of the healing. If I see that those healing spells are on cooldown, then I will manually make my wounded characters use a poultice. But I don't like to be wasteful, and I'm fine with micromanaging my characters a bit, so obviously this is up to personal preference. In terms of party composition, this build is a tank build that also does a good amount of damage. The main thing I recommend is to have a mage who can cast healing spells as well as damaging spells and buffs to your party, like weapon enchantments and the haste spell. Generally, I recommend a split of 2 melee characters and 2 ranged ones, because if you have 3 melee characters in your party, they can get stuck, especially in tight areas like corridors. So you can either have 2 mages or a mage and an archer for your ranged characters. You could also have a second tank if you want to, though it's by no means necessary. So you could go for either a damager or tank for your second melee character. In conclusion, this build for a fear-inducing weapon and shield warrior combines the best of tanking and damage in what I think is a pretty satisfying hybrid build. I really enjoy coming up with new ways to combine existing abilities, and I'll be honest, until recently I had never thought of making this particular build, but once I thought about it, I immediately wanted to try it out. It's a fun and new way for me to play a warrior, and I hope you'll also enjoy it. If you're looking forward to more videos about Dragon Age and other games I like, do remember to subscribe, and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members, who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.